Good afternoon. It is indeed a great pleasure to welcome you all to this year's Holberg Debate. We do have a very interesting program this afternoon, and I would like to extend a warm welcome to the panelists, Achille Mbembe, Kathleen Cleaver, and George Galloway, as well as the moderator, Dennis. The Holberg Debate is organized by the Holberg Prize, this year in collaboration with the Norwegian PEN, and with support from the University of Bergen and the Fritt Ord Foundation. As chair of the board of the Holberg Prize, I would like to express our great gratitude to our collaborator and our sponsors. The Holberg Prize is considered to be the equivalent of the Nobel Prize in fields where there are no Nobel Prizes, in arts and humanities, social science, law, and theology. The purpose of the prize is to raise the status of these academic fields and to increase society's awareness of the importance of research in the fields. Following up this purpose, the Holberg Debate was established in 2016 as an annual event for exploring some of the most challenging issues of our time. Including the views of a wide range of prominent speakers, we hope to stimulate both academic and public debate on such issues. The Holberg Prize and the Holberg Debate are named after Ludwig Holberg, who was born in Bergen in 1684 and became professor at the University of Copenhagen in several of the fields covered by the Holberg Prize. He's also well known as a playwright, in particular for his comedies and satirical works on highly relevant social issues. In a couple of days, on the 3rd of December, it is 334 years since he was born. The Holberg Debate is a very meaningful way of celebrating Ludwig Holberg's birthday. So now, giving the floor to the academic director of the Holberg Prize, Professor Ellen Mortensen, I will again welcome all of you to this year's Holberg Debate. Thank you.
Thank you, Sigmund. We have chosen Politics and Affects, the Dynamics of Social Mobilization as the theme for this year's Holberg Debate. Half a century has passed since 1968, the year of revolt. Since then, numerous large social movements worldwide have emerged as popular responses to a wide spectrum of political issues. Social movements vary greatly in form, and the issues range from the demand for political revolution to racial, sexual, and feminist liberation, anti-war efforts, national sovereignty, globalization, migration, to presidential elections. Central to the dynamics of any kind of social mobilization is the question of how affects come into play in politics. On the one hand, affects may play an essential and positive role in the political process. On the other, affective polarization seems to have increased dramatically over the last few years. The new politics of affects may be reflected in increased political awareness among the electorate, but also in increased animosity between political camps as well as between nations. Looking at social mobilization in Africa, Europe, and North America over the last 50 years, the Holberg Debate 2018 seeks to explore the relationship between politics and affects and how it may differ over time and in various parts of the world. We have invited the following exciting panelists: Achille Mbembe, professor at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg; Kathleen Cleaver, professor and senior lecturer at Emory University School of Law; and George Galloway, writer, broadcaster, and former member of Parliament in the UK. We are also very pleased to welcome Dennis, who will moderate today's event. Dennis is a principal presenter at Al Jazeera English. Before joining Al Jazeera, she worked for Sky News and BBC World News for many years, with a particular focus on politics and current affairs in Africa. In 2014, she joined Al Jazeera, where she presents an insight story in addition to anchoring regular news programs. We are thrilled to have Martine with us, and she will now lead us through the rest of the program. Denise, the floor is yours. Martine, I'm sorry. Martine Dennis, ladies and gentlemen.
Right. Thank you all very much indeed, and another big welcome to the Holberg Debate 2018. Before we start, can I encourage you to use Twitter, or even if you're here in the room with us, put your hand up. We'd really like your contribution to the debate. Our panelists can really do with a bit of extra scrutiny that I know you can provide. So our hashtag is hashtag Holberg 2018 and hashtag Holberg18. So lots of contribution, please, from all of you. And now let me introduce our first panelist, Achille Mbembe. Now, he's described in a multitude of ways: historian, social and political theorist, a post-colonialist, a philosopher. So I'm not really sure which description fits best, which is most appropriate. But what I am certain of is that he's produced a prodigious amount of work about the nature of African societies, their relationship with the rest of the world, and indeed with themselves. His deconstruction of modernity and the nature of race and racism have influenced a generation and helped shape today's discourse. Professor Mbembe was born in what is now Cameroon. He studied in France, he studied and taught extensively in the United States, and he's led research into social sciences in Senegal, and his current post is at Johannesburg Witwatersrand University at the Institute for Social and Economic Research. So it is my pleasure to invite Achille Mbembe to the podium.
Thank you very much, Martine. First of all, I would like to genuinely thank Sigmund, Ulle, Solveig, Ellen and the Holberg team, not only for inviting me here, but also for making me feel welcomed. I was at the center of a rather unfortunate incident at the airport in Bergen, when I landed here the day before yesterday, the details of which I will spare you from. Suffice it to mention that in spite of the perfectly legal nature of my brief presence in your country, I was subjected to a thorough racial profiling by 3 police officers. I mentioned this incident, and please don't take it personally. I mention it not only because you have the right to know how certain classes of people are daily treated at the borders of your country. I mention it not only because you have to know, therefore, the price they may be requested to pay for your kind hospitality, but also because this incident is significant of the general temperament of our times, of which Ellen said a few words in her introduction. As such, I judge it to be highly relevant to the kind of issues we are called upon to reflect upon here this afternoon. Indeed, as Ellen intimated, there are different conceptualizations of affect. But there is a particular kind of affect I would like to call racist affect, which is definitely a key component of the current world climate, or if you want, world atmosphere. And I use these 2 terms, climate and atmosphere, purposefully. What is racist affect? Racist affect is partly about how negative and dark emotions circulate between bodies which are taken as signs of strangeness. The work racist affect does is to single out bodies, to separate, isolate such bodies, to tear them apart from other bodies until a point when this separation and this tearing apart reaches a moment of maximal intensity. And in the current climate and atmosphere, we can witness such moments of maximal intensity at various borders of the world. Racist affect is about the disrupting encounter with a body that is not mine, a face that is not mine, a body and a face whose difference or alterity vividly interpellates me, a body and a face I refuse to recognize as made in the image of my own body and of my own face. A face and a body which profoundly disturbs me, even shocks me, to the point where, in relation to it, I am likely to always act irrationally. I am likely to always act compulsively and in a destructive manner. So this compulsion to act in a destructive manner, this willful misrecognition of the other's face, this urge to mistreat the other's body, to inflict injury to the self of the other, this is the kind of job our 3 policemen were performing at the border, or to put it precisely, this is the job they are expected to perform at most of the borders of Europe today, tracking and racially profiling the stranger. 2 days ago I happened to be their target, but of course it could have happened to any other person with a skin like mine. I mention all of this because not to make you feel guilty or not to make you feel uncomfortable. I mention all of this, and this is the second kind of affect typical of the current world climate and atmosphere. I mention all of this because one of the major contradictions of liberal democratic order has always been the tension between freedom and security. Today, this question seems to have been resolved. Security nowadays trumps freedom. It matters, apparently, more than freedom. Now, the fact is that a society of security is not necessarily a society of freedom. A society of security is a society dominated by the irrepressible need for adherence to a collection of myths taken for certainties. It is a society that is fundamentally fearful of the truth, fearful of the unknown, and ultimately fearful of itself. It is this deep-seated fear of itself that is then projected outside to whoever stands as a stranger or as a foreigner. This is why, in a society of security, the priority is, at all cost, to identify what lurks behind each new arrival, who is who lives where, with whom, and since when, who does what, who comes from where, who is going where, when, how, why, and so on and so forth. Generalized suspicion and lack of trust. And it seems to me that this generalization of suspicion and this lack of trust are typical of the affective nature of our times. The aim of a society of security is not to affirm freedom, but to control and govern the modes of arrival, the modes of public appearance. And the current myth claims that technology constitutes the best tool for governing these arrivals or these modes of public appearance. And for the time being, strangers, migrants, and refugees are bearing the brunt of it. In the long run, it is by no means certain that they will be the only ones. Now, that's the first set of comments I wanted to put on the table as we engage in this very important discussion. Let me now move to a second set of remarks, and they also have to do with some of the constituent features of these times of ours, because ultimately that is what we are asked to comment upon. The constituent features of this peculiar moment our world is going through, a moment for which there doesn't yet seem to be what I would call a proper name. Many names, of course, have been bandied around. For some, we are back to the European 1930s. For others, we are witnessing the return of fascism. Still, for others, we are entering the age of dark enlightenment or illiberal or authoritarian democracies. For others, we are dealing with populism. Since naming our time is part of what is at stake, as we can clearly see, I suggest that in the midst of the current confusion, one thing at least is clear. Ours is a time of planetary entanglement. We are more than ever before and at any other time in human history exposed to each other. And there is no going back to that being exposed to each other. Worldwide, the combination of fast capitalism, soft power warfare, and the saturation of the everyday by digital and computational technologies, these factors have led to the acceleration of speed and the intensification of connections. And once again, there is no going back as far as these processes are concerned. But entanglement is not all that characterizes the now. Indeed, wherever we look, in Europe, in America, Latin America, Asia, or Africa, wherever we look, the drive is simultaneously, and I would say decisively, towards contraction, towards containment, and towards enclosure. Typical of this triple logic of contraction, containment, and enclosure has been and is the erection worldwide of all kinds of walls and fortifications, all kinds of gates and enclaves. In other words, various practices of partitioning space, of offshoring and fencing of wealth, the levels of inequalities we see growing almost everywhere, of splintering territories, of fragmenting spaces, saddling them with various kinds of borders so as to better control movement and speed, accelerating it here, decelerating it there, and in the process, sorting out, recategorizing, reclassifying people with the goal of better selecting anew who is whom, who should be where, and who shouldn't, all in the name of security. And for their full deployment, affects need infrastructures. The border is one such key infrastructure sustaining the proliferation of racist affect in our contemporary world. As a result, borders are increasingly the name we should use to describe the organized racial violence that underpins both contemporary capitalism and our world order in general. Now, since I mentioned borders, let me just add very quickly how it is that they are becoming more and more virtual. They are becoming more and more mobile, portable, omnipresent, a ubiquitous reality, thanks precisely to what I would call technological escalation. And I would therefore like to make some comments on this idea of technological escalation, which is part, indeed, of the constituent features of our times. So, first of all, as far as technological escalation is concerned, and the kinds of subjects it produces, and the kind of effect it generates, it is a fact that unprecedented numbers of human beings are today embedded in increasingly complex technostructures, while significantly intervening in the dynamics of the Earth system on a planetary scale. And this has led to the transgression of planetary boundaries, such as those related to anthropogenic climate change, degenerative land use change, accelerated biodiversity loss, perturbation of the global bio-geochemical cycles of nitrogen, or for that matter, phosphorus, and the creation and release of novel entities such as nanoparticles, genetically engineered organisms, and so forth and so on. Second, it is true that technologies are becoming more and more tied in complex networks of extraction and predation. Take, for instance, what is going on in the domain of genes and molecules. The genetic codes of humans, of plants, of animals has been cracked. This, in turn, has given way to an exponential rise in biological patents. And nearly, as you may know, 20% of the human genome is now privately owned. And life itself is increasingly seen as a commodity to be manipulated, to be replicated, while corporations are intervening directly in the natural cycles of life and ecosystems through the widespread genetic modification of key elements, for instance, in the food chains. Why am I giving you all these examples? The point I want to make is that, in fact, to some extent, there is a shifting distribution of powers going on between the human and the technological, in the sense that technologies are moving towards general intelligence and self-replication. And in the process, the kind of subject, human subject, they are producing, and the kind of effect they are generating is all but entirely different from the types of human subjects and affect we were used to, which was supposed to sustain the democratic project. That's the argument I'm trying to make. And then to all of this, we have to add what is going on in the field of knowledge, where, along with the predominance of statistical forms of reasoning, we have witnessed the development of algorithmic forms of intelligence, which are growing in parallel with genetic research and often in alliance with it. and the integration of algorithms and big data analysis in the biological sphere brings with it, of course, a greater belief in techno-positivism and in the idea that everything is computable, everything can be turned into a data or a code. And that is another aspect of the dominant affect of our times. So, a dominant affect of our times, let me repeat, is the belief that everything is potentially computable, calculable, and predictable. It is the belief that the fundamentals of truth can now be better expressed in the form of algorithmic thinking by machines of different kinds, machines which are capable of making decisions on our behalf. Of course, this new state of being has dramatic consequences on the future of knowledge and on the future of democracy itself. As far as knowledge is concerned, we have reached a point where knowledge is increasingly defined as knowledge for the market. And since markets themselves are increasingly turning into algorithmic structures, the only useful knowledge today is supposed to be algorithmic. As a result of the conflation of knowledge, computation, and markets, contempt has been extended to anyone who has nothing to sell and nothing to buy, or to anything that cannot be bought. As a result, once again, the Enlightenment notion of the rational subject capable of deliberation and choice is gradually replaced by the consciously deliberating and choosing consumer. Then we should factor in the quasi-hallucinatory power unleashed by contemporary computational technologies. These technologies have, maybe in spite of their original intention, become key devices in the dissemination of micro-fascism in the interstices of today's real. I could go on and on this. Let me leave it at that and try to sum up the kinds of arguments I wanted to make. Sum it up in this way. Finance capitalism and technological escalation have left in their wake a multitude of destroyed subjects, many of whom are deeply convinced that their immediate future will be one of continuous exposure to violence and existential threat. They genuinely long for a return to some sense of certainty, some sense of the sacred, some sense of hierarchy, of religion and tradition. They believe that nations have become akin to swamps that need to be drained, and the world as it is should be brought to the end. Thus, the apocalyptic effect that saturates science fiction, certain musical forms, and so forth and so on. They believe that for this to happen, everything should be cleansed off. They are convinced that they can only be saved in a violent struggle to restore their masculinity and virility, the loss of which they unfortunately attribute to the weaker amongst them, the weak they do not want to become. In this context, the most successful political entrepreneurs are increasingly those who convincingly speak to the losers, to the destroyed men and women of globalization, and to their ruined identities. And in the street fight politics has become, reason hardly matters any longer. Suspicion and mistrust are what prevails. Facts don't prevail. Politics is therefore in danger of reverting into an endless game of suspicion and brutal survivalism in an ultra-competitive environment. Under such conditions, unfortunately, it is very difficult to see how affect, as such, can be mobilized for the benefit of a progressive and future-oriented mass politics of the left, for those of us who claim to be from the left. Let me conclude. Neoliberalism has created the conditions for renewed conversions and at times fusion between the living human being and the objects which supplement or augment us. This event, which we can equate to a return to animism, is nevertheless not without danger for the idea of freedom, emancipation, and democracy. Democracy cannot survive in a factless world. Such a world is, by definition, hostile to the very idea of reason and of freedom. It is also hostile to democracy, understood not as ending at the borders of any national state, but as a kind of planetary and shared responsibility and agency in relation to the future of all inhabitants of the earth, humans and other than humans. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can you sit here, please? Thank you. Professor Mbembe, thank you very much indeed. And a reminder, of course, the hashtag is at Holberg18 or Holberg 2018. We'd really love to hear from all of you. Our second speaker is Senior Lecturer and Research Fellow at Emory University School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia. Kathleen Cleaver's journey to Emory has been a fascinating one, distinguished by a commitment to human rights and to social justice. Born in a segregated United States, at a young age, she marched with her parents in Alabama. From marching, she progressed to organizing, first with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and then perhaps most famously with the Black Panther Party. As the Panthers' first communications secretary and one of the party's first women decision makers, Kathleen Cleaver learned a thing or two about social mobilization. There are pictures of her at that time in the late 60s and 1970s in a leather jacket with an impressive afro and wearing a determined, even defiant expression. Well, the turbulence of those times, as Professor Cleaver and her comrades fought for black action, led to near constant police surveillance and, as a result, eventually to exile in both France and Algeria. On her return to the United States, Kathleen Cleaver took on another weapon in her fight for social justice, the law. Please welcome Professor Kathleen Cleaver.
Thank you. Well, I'm very pleased to be here, and what I'm going to talk about, our topic is politics of mobilization. Professor that just spoke gave us a very demoralizing view of the future. I'm actually going to talk to you about the past, politics of mobilization during the moment in which I was very involved, and so were thousands of other young black people in the United States in the Black Panther Party. During the 1960s and during the tumultuous era of the Vietnam War in the United States, our society became very, very divided and in many violent ways. There was a rise in what we called, they called them riots, we called them rebellions, urban rebellions by black communities, which coincided with the radical dislocation of the society caused by the intensive warfare unfurling in Vietnam for such a long time. There were so many people who went to Vietnam or were killed in Vietnam or escaped the United States because they didn't want to go to Vietnam. There was no way to remain untouched if you lived in the United States, and particularly if you were a young black man, because they emptied high schools around the country where black kids lived to send them off to Vietnam. It was the first time, actually, in the U.S. Army that so many black and white men had to interact together. So there was the war against the Vietnamese, and then there was war within the United States Army. And much of the social upheaval and radical changes that were experienced during this era of the late 60s and early 70s in the United States was connected to the way the Vietnam War was televised. There was no one in America that couldn't see it. In fact, my children mentioned that. It was horrible. And when my son would draw pictures, you know, little children with their crayons, he'd draw airplanes dropping bombs. It was like 6 or 7 years old. So there's a whole generation traumatized by Vietnam. And as the war continued to absorb resources, provoke violent opposition, like, for one, the urban rebellion in Detroit, which was really stimulated by racial violence and inequality, etc., what did the government do? They sent General Westmoreland and the 101st Airborne Division into Detroit to put... Now listen, if you've got Westmoreland and you've got the 102nd Airborne Division, you're not dealing with a riot. This is something else. This is the revolutionary uprising. And it went on for days, and to the point that the city that was known as Detroit became called Destroyed. Some of the military who had returned from Vietnam, and in particular one soldier I came to know very well named Geronimo Pratt, who later became a member of the Black Panther Party, a leader of the Black Panther Party, and many years after that actually became my son-in-law. He married my little daughter. Who was probably 2 when he went off to Vietnam. Geronimo Pratt decided that he would help further the rebellion underway in Detroit as opposed to following the general's design, and he and other black soldiers enabled the freedom fighters who were on the roofs in Detroit and in the community in Detroit fighting the police. That's why they brought in the army, because the police of Detroit couldn't handle what was going on, that they would give access to the rebellion of the armory, which was filled with guns and ammunition. Well, for that, he was actually due to be discharged from the army, but in fact, he was sent back to Vietnam for another tour of duty. And I think the attitude, as well, and we hope you die. Well, he survived, he came back. His sister lived in Los Angeles. He was from Louisiana, but his sister lived in his sister lived in California, and he moved out to live with her so he could go to UCLA on the GI Bill. So this is a very young man. Maybe he's 20, 21 by the time he gets to UCLA. And it just happened that at UCLA, there was a black student union, and some of the Black Panthers were members of that black student union if they were UCLA students. So Geronimo Pratt, military veteran, young man from Louisiana, comes to UCLA and gets caught up in something called the Black Panther Party, and actually becomes one of the key leaders of the Black Panther Party. At that point, it was called the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. It was a new organization. The Black Panther Party for Self-Defense was a new organization. When I say new, it wasn't an old organization like the NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Black People, or Negroes, I think it was, colored people. NAACP, National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. The Black Panther Party was started in 1966, and it started with 2 men. One was Bobby Seale, who was a military veteran, and he'd come back and gone to college. He was married, he had a son, he was an adult, he had a career, and I think he was a draftsman. And Huey Newton, who was a law student, and they were both from Oakland. They met at Merritt College, and they became part of a student organization. I think it was called the Soul Students. And in this era, the Vietnam War and the Black Power era, organizing in students, black students became very lively and had lots of organizations. There was rebellions, and it was a very, very vibrant and in many ways dangerous time. Both of them lived lived in Oakland, and in late October of 1966, the two of them were discussing what they thought should be the kind of organization the black community needed, and they created this idea, a platform, a program, 10-point platform and program of what the organization should do. The first point was, we want power to determine the destiny of our own black community. And it went on with various principles of, housing and justice and economic activity, et cetera. The program was focused on eliminating all the kinds of restrictions and obstacles that the racial bias, the legal system, and the basic American culture was putting in the barriers of black communities. The program was modeled in part on the program articulated by the Nation of Islam, which was an organization that Malcolm X at that time was the most prominent spokesman for. And it was very captivating, except for the fact it had this odd religion. So a lot of people liked the ideas, but they didn't want to be Muslims. They probably didn't even want to be Christians. They wanted to be something non-religious. But they liked the discipline, and they liked the enthusiasm that the Muslims had. But like Bobby Seale said, they wanted to be secular. So he said, we have no religion. Black Panther Party doesn't have a religion. You have a religion, it's on you, but the organization, unlike the Nation of Islam, did not require you to accept any particular religion. The program of the Black Panther Party, which had 10 points, wanted we want power to determine the destiny of our own black community, we want justice, we want economic advancement, a series of things that were pretty basic and had been articulated over generation and generation and generation by black organizations. The most important thing was the gain in self-determination and independence to be able to remove the limitations imposed by racial bias in education, in health, in employment, and political activity. It was started by two men. One was Huey Newton, he was 26, and I think Bobby Seale might have been 30. So that's pretty ambitious. They articulated a platform, they articulated a program, and people began to join it. It was started in Oakland, California, a place that I think Gertrude Stein said there's no there. Well, the Black Panthers came from there. The Black Panthers put Oakland on the map, in a way. But the organization, because it was visible in the Oakland community, and the Panthers chose to wear a certain type of clothing. California's not very cold, so the warmest kind of coat you might think is leather jacket. So black leather jacket for men, blue shirt, black beret, black pants, black shoes. They looked very attractive, and they were armed. In California, it was not against the law to carry a weapon openly. If you wanted to conceal a weapon, you had to have a permit to do that. But open carrying of weapons, it were like fish and game laws. They didn't have any particular restrictions on carrying weapons until they saw the Black Panthers in their black leather jackets and black berets marching with rifles. Particularly when they went to the state capitol, Sacramento, there was a bill being proposed to change the gun laws, and the Panthers said, well, we want to go up and observe this this legislation. Now, no one in the Black Panther Party had ever been to the state capitol, so they didn't actually know where you go to observe the deliberations. So they walked into the state capitol, leather jackets, black berets, rifles, and I'm sure they intimidated quite a few people. And they asked members of the press, well, where do we go to observe the deliberations? Because they were going to vote on something called the Mulford Bill, and the Mulford Bill was going to change the gun laws. So the press was so astonished to see this parade of, I think it was about 12 or 13 men and women dressed that way, carrying weapons. There. And they directed them straight onto the floor of the State Assembly. And they marched in, and these congressmen and representatives started ducking under their chairs and hiding, and they thought they were being invaded. In fact, that was what the newspaper story said. Panthers invade the state. No, they were just actually coming to watch. But they became the subject. And so that put the Black Panther Party on the map. They were around the country. That particular story made a big hit. And for young black men and young black women who were frustrated or angry or thought the nonviolent movement was a little too peaceful, oh, it was great. They all wanted to join the Black Panther Party. So they couldn't join it unless they lived in California, but what happened is people would start Black Panther Party chapters where they lived. Every party had to accept a 10-point platform and program. It was similar to that of the Nation of Islam in that it had 10 points, but they were about different things. First of all, Bobby Seale said, we have no religion in our organization. His family was very religious. He was quite tired of it. And so we have a secular organization. You have whatever religion you want. There was one of the sisters who was in the Black Panther Party who kept it a secret because she played the piano at her church. But she was a student also at San Francisco State. So many of the Black Panthers in the early days were members of the Black Student Union at the San Francisco State College. So she wouldn't tell people, but she'd be a Panther all week, and then on Sunday she'd go to church and play the piano. And I'm sure she didn't tell the church that she was in the Black Panthers. So the Black Panther Party had a lot of visual appeal, and it was startling. And because California is warm and it's sunny, you could be outside all the time, and people would see them and want to know, well, who are those people and what's going on? It was very captivating and exciting. To decide how the party was going to be led, Huey and Bobby said, we'll flip a coin. And whoever chose heads would be the chairman, and whoever chose tails would be the Minister of Defense. So Huey Newton became the Minister of Defense, Bobby Seale became the chairman. Around that time, I had abandoned college twice. This is the second time I had abandoned college to work full-time in the civil rights movement in the city of New York, which had a headquarters of an organization, a fundraising office of an organization called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. That organization was headed up at that time by a young man named Stokely Carmichael. Does that name register here? Well, he was extremely good-looking, very, very articulate. He was from the Caribbean, so when he spoke English, he had a certain accent. The fact he had an accent, that he was handsome, he was 6'2", he was brilliant. Oh, he was a star. I assure you, he was a star. And many people were attracted to his ideas. The organization called the Black Panther Party actually wanted to essentially pull him and his group into the Black Panther Party. And they said, well, you should merge with us. No, they didn't like that idea. They wanted to have their own organization. But we did have a joint rally in Oakland and also in Los Angeles, where members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, members of the Black Panther Party, were talking about the case of Huey Newton. Now, what's the case of Huey Newton? Huey Newton was the young man who had started the Black Panther Party along with Bobby Seale. One evening, coming home from a party in Oakland, he was stopped by a policeman, and this particular policeman was a well-known, thuggish guy. And so he pulled Huey Newton over and said, so who do we have here? The great Huey Newton. They got into some kind of confrontation. Huey came out wounded. Fry ended up dead. It happened like 4 o'clock in the morning. It was dark, but not completely dark. As it came out in the trial, that you could see a little bit. But this created a very, very, how would I say, dramatic moment. And Eldridge Cleaver, who I had met at a conference, he was a secret member of the Black Panther Party because he was an ex-convict and not allowed to associate with weapons. The Black Panther Party was an armed organization. So he was a member, but it wasn't public. And on the letterhead, it said, Minister of Information, Underground. As if a 6'2" black guy like Eldridge Cleaver could be underground. Anyway, I met him at a conference in Nashville. He went back to California, but he kept calling me and talking to me. We were very attracted to each other. I lived in Atlanta. He lived in California. He was a prisoner. He couldn't travel that easily. I was a worker in a company, in a civil rights group that didn't have any money, so I didn't have any income, but I wanted to go visit him. Now, they had something, you could buy a ticket to California for $12 if you take a night flight. If you can get to Los Angeles, you get a PSA flight for $12 to Oakland. So I hitchhiked a ride, got all the way to California, got a PSA $12 ticket, and went up to California, went up to San Francisco, and visited him. And he said, well, I think I've been there about 2 days. And he said, well, I think we should get engaged. I said, oh, that's a good idea. Let's do that. He said, well, you get engaged to do something else. I said, what's that? Get married. Yeah, well, let's get married. Okay. I mean, he was handsome, and I was in love. I didn't really want to be married, and neither did he. So it took us a while to get married, but we agreed. We got engaged. And I moved from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee in Atlanta, where I was doing work for something called the campus program, which basically meant going to campuses, holding meetings, and recruiting people to work in the movement. But by the time I arrived at the SNCC office, it had become the SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. They called it the Non-Student, Non-Coordinated, Non-Committee. And it was essentially transitioning into either not an organization at all or a revolutionary movement, and it didn't have very much money. So the organization was shrinking. None of us ever got paid. I persuaded my father that he should send me a check that he used to pay when I went to college, pay me, and I'd get an education in SNCC better than I was getting at Columbia, at Barnard College, the women's college at Columbia. So he said he'd do it for a year. So I would get my check, and I'd support actually my whole little crew of civil rights workers who none of us had a salary. We didn't have to pay rent because the buildings were given to us. So I was supporting my whole little unit of this, what is it called, campus program at SNCC. And then my comrades found out I had fallen in love with Eldridge Cleaver. They were quite distraught, and they didn't want me to go. In fact, they chased me. You know, I'm going to the airport. I'm taking a plane. I'm going to California. No, you're not. No, you're not. Yes, I am. And so I went out to California, and I think I'd been there 3 days. Eldridge and I got engaged, and he said, you get engaged to do something, don't you? I said, yeah, what? He said, get married. He said, well, let's get married. I said, okay. It took us a long time after that to actually get married, but we agreed. We agreed to get married. I had met him earlier at a SNCC conference that was held in Nashville at the Fisk University. And what was so intriguing is that all the people who had been invited, all the scholars and writers and significant celebrities we had invited, none of them could come because it was a snowfall all along the East Coast, and all the airports were closed. But Eldridge Cleaver lived in San Francisco, and they didn't have any snow. So he was the actually only speaker. We were very thrilled to have him at our conference. He was charismatic. He was part of a very radical group, and he was a writer at a magazine called Ramparts. You're probably too young to have ever heard of Ramparts, but it was extremely, it was a slick, very intriguing magazine that had a lot of literary authors, and some of his writings had been published in that, and we in the Black movement found out about him through that magazine and were quite impressed with his writing. By the time I had moved out there, Huey Newton had been arrested after a gun battle in Oakland with a policeman. In fact, there were two policemen. One of them died. One of them survived and said he never saw anything. He didn't know what happened. Huey Newton was wounded, and there was another person there with him we didn't know about who ran away. And we didn't know about him until the case came to trial. So this became a very key mobilizing case. Huey Newton, Minister of Defense of the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, accused of murdering John Fry, Oakland policeman. It was during the Vietnam War. It was in a time of lots of uprisings and rebellions in the United States. the war in Vietnam. It was a very tumultuous time, and the Black Panther Party participated, encouraged, and sort of represented that in the town of Oakland. As the trial began, Newton is a black man, and we decided, his parents I'm sure would never have decided that, but we decided that he decided he wanted to be tried as the Minister of Defense of the Black Panther Party, which is a very, very political choice, not one that any NAACP lawyer would have suggested. But we didn't have an NAACP lawyer. We had a lawyer named Charles Gary, who had been part of the Progressive Party. And the reason we chose him, first of all, he said we could pay him as we go. And secondly, he had been an activist. He'd been a leader in labor movements. And at this point, he was a criminal defense lawyer who had basically won almost every criminal case he tried. So we wanted him. He was very expensive. And basically, he said, raise the money as we go. He'd take it on, consignment, so to speak. So the case went to trial. We were always out throughout the courthouse, demonstrating, protesting, raising money. I rode around on a sound truck to attract people to come down to the courthouse, and we play music. One of the songs was, I think it was Junior Walker, Shoot Your Shot. It was a very lively R&B song. And we'd turn the music up, and people would listen and see that we were riding through the neighborhood. And I'd say, come down to the courthouse, see about Huey. And one lady leaned out and said, yeah, he's going to the gas chamber. It's a black man accused of killing a white policeman. Of course he's going to the gas chamber. Well, actually, he didn't go to the gas chamber. He went to jail, but he didn't go to the gas chamber. The organization that was started in 1966 had been gained an enormous amount of attention from the Huey Newton trial. Charles Gary is a brilliant attorney. I happened to be writing press releases quite a bit about what he was doing. We had demonstrations outside the courtroom. I think one of these pictures on the Holberg Debate, it's not our courtroom in Oakland, but it's one of the courtrooms in this country. Panthers were there, and the Black Panther Party grew as that trial progressed. So mobilizing support in the Bay Area led us to hold rallies all over the park, rallies wherever we could, bring people out to sing. The Peace and Freedom Party group that wanted to get on the ballot, we had an agreement. You help us rent the material we need for these rallies, and you can get all the people that come to our meetings to sign up. And they got enough signatures, and they got on the ballot. So when they were on the ballot, they ran Eldridge Cleaver for president, Bobby Seale for Congress. I think they ran me for city council. So the Peace and Freedom Party was clearly a protest party. We didn't want the office. We wanted the publicity and the awareness. And so we were committed to challenging the power structure in an electoral as well as a Panther Party way, and mobilizing the community to support our goals. The Black Panthers became very popular because of the way they were able to mobilize men and women and young people and challenge the state and challenge the violence in a cheerful and delightful way. Well, I have to end. I have 3 more pages, but not allowed, unless you want to make an exception.
No, I'm sure we can get to that in conversation, I think.
Oh, no, you
Professor
can't.
Kathleen Cleaver, thank you very much indeed. Thank you. Kathleen, come this way. Thank you. Yeah, keep that on. Yeah, come and sit next to Achille. And again, I'm going to nag you. Hashtag Holberg 18 or hashtag Holberg 2018. Your questions, please. Our final speaker, George Galloway, is also a young starter. He was very young when he started in Scottish politics. He was 13 when he joined the Labour Party. Like so many young socialists, he was inspired by Che Guevara. Young George quickly rose through the ranks to become the Scottish Labour Party's youngest ever chairman. His political voice came from the left for the ordinary worker. But it was a trip to Beirut in the 1970s that broadened his focus to the plight of the Palestinians, forced from their land and transformed into a refugee nation of disparate parts. His embrace of the Palestinian and the wider Arab cause put him on a collision course with the establishment. George Galloway has spent a lifetime seeking to overturn conventional attitudes, and that has inevitably earned him the label controversial. With the Labour Party and without the Labour Party, George Galloway has served as a Member of Parliament for the best part of 30 years. His opposition to the Iraq War has been well documented, as has his constant advocacy for the rights of Palestinians. Now a broadcaster and a writer, and as ever, an iconoclast. Let's welcome to the podium George Galloway.
Madam Chair, thank you for that lovely introduction. I hope someone wrote it down and we can circulate it to my future meetings. Thank you for the opportunity of appearing on this distinguished platform. As Mr. Churchill said once, forgive me if I make a long speech, I didn't have time to prepare a short one. In fact, I haven't had time to prepare one at all. So I have no idea what I'm going to say, especially in such distinguished academic company. I must, as a health warning, say I am not myself an academic. I left school at the age of 16 and went to work in the Michelin tire factory in Dundee. Probably the only thing I can do that my fellow speakers cannot is I can make a ZX radial tire and change one if it bursts. The meaning of this debate I pondered over long and hard. Here's my definition. Well, it's really Kant and Marx's definition. That theory without practice is empty, but practice without theory is blind. And that dichotomy plays out sometimes in real life. There are all kinds of desiccated philosophy professors toiling over their words but never leaving their studies, and their theory is therefore empty. On the other hand, there are all kinds of advocates of what we on my part of the left at least call voluntarism. It's often practiced by that odd hybrid of libertarianism and anarchism, two sides of the same coin, which is essentially eruptions of activity with no theory to guide them and no movement to be a part of. If the first speech was about the future, and a dystopian one it was, Professor, and the last speech was about the past, and an enchanting one it was, Professor, I want to principally talk about now. But I must say, I will go to my grave very happy indeed to be enshrined in this magnificent piece of iconography that the Holberg Debate has produced, because the very first mass demonstration that I attended was in 1968 when I was 14 years old. I travelled overnight from the Scottish city of Dundee on a coach. Well, they called it a coach. It was a broken down bus which broke down twice on the way to London. But it was an iconic event. The Grosvenor Square demonstration in London in 1968 of 100,000 people, then a record for a left-wing demonstration, was quite something, I can tell you. And it was a part of eruptions, rebellions, revolts, risings all over the world at the carnage, savagery of the American imperialist war on the people of Vietnam. So long before I was known as one of the leaders of a demonstration 25 times the size of that one in the movement against the war in Iraq, long before even my dedication to the Palestinian cause, it was the cause of the fighting, heroic people of Vietnam that captured my heart and the heart of so many. But we were not just rising as the anvil, the Vietnamese people themselves being the hammer to break the American war in Vietnam. We were rising up against the system that seemed, and my goodness, the last half century has not dissuaded us from that, to require endless war and exploitation of other peoples and other people's countries in order to preserve the hegemony of the rich and powerful in the rich and powerful countries. We were rising up because we believed then that the old order was dying, that the new was struggling to be born, and that we were in the time of monsters. And we were. And we are still in the time of monsters. It's a long time, 50 years, in one person's life. It's not so long in historical terms. And I don't believe that those times are qualitatively different from the times in which we are living today. The monsters' faces have changed. In the case of Donald Trump, their IQ has no doubt diminished. I mean, Richard Nixon was the devil, but he was the devil with a degree. He was the devil with an IQ. But that is my reason, forgive me, Professor, for saying I think you were too pessimistic, because the monsters are less than they were. And the victims of the monsters are as good as the Vietnamese people ever were and are now in their multitudes everywhere. I was heavily involved in the struggle to defend Iraq from British and American imperial conquest and occupation. But what drove the Americans and the British out of Iraq was the resistance of the people of Iraq. As ill-armed as any Vietnamese fighter had been. One street, Martin, you'll know it, as an Al Jazeera presenter, one street, Haifa Street in Baghdad. It's a long street, but 244 American soldiers lost their lives there. Many hundreds more lost their blood there, wounded. And by the end, no Western soldier could set foot in Haifa Street because the Iraqi people had risen up against them and drove them from their country, as I and my friends predicted that they would. The very last conversation, Martin, I had with Tony Blair, I hope it's not the last ever. I hope to speak to him again in The Hague when he's on trial for war crimes and crimes against humanity. But the last time I spoke to him in the library corridor of the House of Commons, outside the gentleman's lavatory to be precise, I told him that the Iraqi people will fight you with their teeth, if necessary, until they have driven you from their land. And that's what happened. And so I am not pessimistic about the long-term prospects of these monsters, and for many of the reasons which the first speech laid out. Because as Marx predicted, he was young too, by the way, Catherine, when he predicted it. Marx was in his 20s when he wrote the Communist Manifesto. It's hard to believe now. not even his mid-20s, that all that is sacred will be profaned, all that is solid will melt into air, as globalized capitalism, which he foresaw, builds its hegemony in the world. And that is exactly what has happened. That's why you were, and I'm shocked to hear it in a place like Norway. I'd expect it at Heathrow or Gatwick. But I'm shocked to hear what happened to you here in Bergen at the airport. I'm shocked, but I'm not surprised. Because why are they guarding their borders? They're guarding their borders because beyond those borders, the victims of the imperialist system, the globalized capitalist system, are massing and moving. Why are they leaving their own spaces? Because their spaces have been turned into desert, literally as well as metaphorically, by our economic system, which we are the principal beneficiaries of. Deserts, desertified by exploitation and war and environmental depredation. That's why masses, millions, one day it will be tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people are on the move. No wonder they're guarding their borders. Because they are afraid, as you said, afraid. Not just of them, but afraid of themselves, because they know that we know, not they, we know. Those of us from these privileged spaces know that we are rich because they are poor. In order for us to be rich, they have to be poor. Their resources, their commodities, their raw materials have to be looted by us in order that our rich societies can continually get richer. Not that, of course, everybody in our societies are rich, and that's the additional problem for our rulers. Because just as their system requires the exploitation of the other, it also requires the exploitation at home of the mass, the majority of our own people. Let me give you just one example. A man called Jeff Bezos. You've probably got a book waiting to be delivered by him right now. Jeff Bezos is the richest man in the world. And in the time that I've been speaking, he has earned, if that's the word, at least £2 million. Because he's earning, if that's the word, $124 million a day. One man. While his workforce, which is now several 100,000 people, those in the United States, are receiving food stamps from the government. So miserly are the wages that he is paying his own workers. In Britain, where he doesn't pay any tax, I may say, to maintain the civilized country that he wants to set up his business in. None of these people pay tax. There are footballers paying more tax than Amazon, more tax than Facebook. One individual footballer just signed a new contract which will require him to pay more tax than Amazon, the richest corporation in the world. In Britain, their workers are being subsidized by the taxpayer too. And they're very angry about it, as are the workers of Amazon in the United States. In fact, the workers everywhere in the capitalist world are very angry. Now, what to do about it? I'm not a great fan of identity politics. I recognize that every one of us has our own identity, of course. Some are men, some are women, some are gay, some are straight, some are black, some are white. All kinds of identities. And respect for those identities is, of course, essential. Essential for our very existence as civilized, rational humans. But the one overarching identity that we all can share, and most of us do, is our class identity. Our relationship to wealth and power, to the means of production, distribution, and exchange. That's the most important identity. Of course, if all workers are oppressed, black workers are more oppressed, women are oppressed, not just as workers, but also as women, gay people, other minorities, and so on. Of course, that's true. But if we endlessly fixate on individual identities in a way that actually turns one group of the exploited against another group of the exploited, then the only beneficiary is Jeff Bezos and the other owners of the globalized capitalist system. So I don't know how vital that point is in this quite monochrome audience in a place like Norway. But for those watching online, I hope they will hear me when I say that we have to find unity in action for a profound change in how we are and where we are. I close on some points about today. I just have watched a revolting, I mean literally revolting, repugnant, repulsive dance in Buenos Aires, where a man who, not literally but metaphorically in the most acute sense, literally chopped up a newspaper columnist, Jamal Khashoggi, whom I knew. I've touched his hand. I've kissed his cheek. I've embraced him. Was literally chopped into pieces on the orders of the so-called crown prince of what they call Saudi Arabia. And he's cavorting in Buenos Aires with all the world's leaders. Some have the sense to avert their eyes as he walks by. Others not. But all of them, behind closed doors, are kissing his ass for money. It is the perfect example of the utter amorality of the system that we live in and the leaders that we elect, or in some cases are thrust upon us. It is the perfect example of the moral bankruptcy of the prevailing orthodoxy in the world that we have. It is an example of what Marx talked about. It is that which is sacred being profaned. And why do I say that these monsters will not rule, not reign forever? Because of these inherent contradictions. that you talked about so brilliantly in your exposition. The very means of scientific, digital, computational advance. Let me give you an example. When I started out at 13, Martin, in order to call you to a meeting, I had to type the notice onto a stencil. You don't know what I'm talking about. It's a skin. I had to type it. I mean type with keys hitting the skin. Then I had to put it on a drum filled with ink. Then I had to turn it. Then I had to cut it into small pieces. Then I had to go out onto the street and find you to call you to this meeting. In order to make profits, they have developed beyond, just in my lifetime, beyond all imagination, the means of communication. They did it to make profits, but they created, again as Marx said in 1848 that they would, they are providing the spades for their own grave diggers. They have provided us with now the means. There are people watching this in Buenos Aires, because my wife's filming it. There are people watching this in the Guguletu township, where I gave some blood in your cause in the 1980s, whilst underground, Ms. Cleaver, myself, for the ANC in South Africa. There are people watching this everywhere. There are people in touch with you and we with them everywhere. Our army is mustering in its millions, tens of millions, and I am certain that we will prevail. Thank you very much.
Thank you. All right, so everybody's mustering in their millions. I would just be happy with a few hundred questions, okay? So if you could, again, hashtag Holberg18 or Holberg 2018. I'll give you a break, George. That was a very compelling performance. Thank you. Achille, let me start with you, seeing as you've had more time to recover. The starting point...
Not after him.
He's always a hard act to follow. I'm sorry.
Well, good. He's last.
But if 1968 is our starting point, and then we've heard what Kathleen and the situation in the United States, North America generally, and then we've heard from George about the situation for him in Scotland, in London, and we know about, more broadly, Europe in 1968, the year of revolt. I'm particularly interested in hearing about how did the year of revolt manifest itself in Africa? We had newly colonized, newly independent countries, nominally at least, Ghana, 1957, a few other countries. Did the year of revolt mean anything significant in terms of the African continent?
Part of what is going on in the African continent in those years you are referring to has to do with the unfinished struggle for decolonization, which meant in those years struggle for deracialization, because colonialism and racism come together in one package, the same DNA. Such was the case, for instance, in the Portuguese-held colonies of Angola, Mozambique, Cape Verde, and Guinea-Bissau. And such was the case in southern Africa in particular, with the settler colonies of Rhodesia, Namibia to some extent, and more importantly in South Africa with the apartheid system. So these struggles had to do a lot with what Kathleen and Mr. Galloway told us. They had to do with how to reshape the world. Mm-hmm. That's what decolonization had to do with. How to reshape the world, how to recapture for everybody the power to shape one's own future, and how to think a future world beyond what Du Bois called the color line. And in that sense, I'm in agreement with you. We are still, what we are dealing with in this planetary age of our times is about who owns the world and how do we share the world as a condition of its durability. So of course there is a continuity here, but there are also some novelties, and I don't think that we are that far apart. I think that the novelty has to do with the technological escalation. And contemporary struggles, resistance struggles, will have somewhat to reckon with the advent of new and so-called intelligent machines. Otherwise, we won't be able to prevail as, I agree, we should. We have to reckon with that novelty.
One of the key aspects of this debate is affect, i.e. the popular emotion, the popular feeling, and how that relates to the political process. I'll stay with you, Achille, on this, because I know that you have concentrated quite a bit on it in your writing. But you talked about racism as an affect, a racist affect. Can you legislate against it? How do you root out a racist affect, for instance?
I will give you here some concrete examples. I live in South Africa. I've been living in South Africa for the last 18 years. I work with the Ahmed Kathrada Foundation. I'm a member of the board of the foundation. Kathrada was known between him, Mandela, and Sisulu as a major proponent of something called non-racialism. I belong to a national network that is striving against racism. Apartheid formally is over. But it's still in the mind, it's still in the landscape. And in fact, it might be the future of our world.
And it's in the mind of not just white South Africans, is it?
Oh, no. It's democratized, if you want. It's a democratization of the apartheid ethos, including here in Norway. I was giving you the example of my silly example at the airport. It is everywhere. It's on the rise. It's on the rise worldwide. It's not simply the problem of the 20th century, as Du Bois argued. It is the problem of the 21st century as well. So you can legislate against racism. What we are trying to do in South Africa is to make sure that racists in our midst are not in peace. They do not pollute the public sphere, for instance. They pay for their acts. So there's a way of legislating about it. But the best way to uproot racism, it has to do with what you were talking about. Animating people's life environments, because they, as he was saying, they have been turned into dust through wars, through exploitation, pillage. And unless we give back life to those environments, it will be very difficult to recapture and reopen the future for all, which is, as I argued, a condition for the Earth's sustainability.
Now, rather clumsily on Twitter, I put out a basic question for people to respond to. And I said, is democracy in crisis? What's behind the rise of populism, racism, sexism? And we've had a few questions coming in. And so I'd like to introduce some of the questions that we've had via Twitter. Ramon Benitez, George, I think this is probably for you. With the rise of fascism, is this capitalism in crisis, he says, and maybe capitalism in its final days, as Marx predicted? So he's clearly on the same page as you.
I don't think that, I think we, and it's partly conditioned by the point I made about identity politics. We should not, ontology is important. We should not misdescribe and misdefine people as fascists just because they're to the right of us. Because that actually can become self-defeating. It's like shouting racist at someone who says something you don't like, fascist at someone who says something you don't like. There is no fascism with the exception perhaps of Brazil, and only if Brazilian society were to permit it. Bolsonaro is definitely a potential fascist. Trump is not a fascist. Fascists don't have midterm elections. Fascists don't get defeated in midterm elections. Fascists don't get overturned in courts, as he very well may. He's an extreme populist, a white nationalist, no doubt all these things, but that's not the same thing as fascism. If we think we're living in a fascist society, then we haven't studied properly enough the kind of societies that actually were fascist, and that's because people like me would no longer be alive in a fascist society.
Right. Kathleen, so George has mentioned the current times in your country, 50 years after the struggles that you and your fellow Black Panthers went through. What would you say are the most significant achievements from that time, and why now, in 2018, do we still have a very, very vibrant Black Lives Matters movement? It seems very much as though Black people in the United States have still got a massive fight on their hands.
They're still Black. The society is still predominantly white. The whites have more wealth because there's more of them. They have more access to wealth, more access to education. And in fact, after Obama was president, there seemed to be a tremendous race to the bottom to see how racist they could get again. That's what I got. I mean, how do you go from Barack Obama as president to Donald Trump?
Well,
I mean,
many people
how does that happen?
Many people have said that this is a direct reaction to the first Black president of the United States.
But he was a good president. And Obama, I mean, this man is an embarrassment. I mean, he's really, really an embarrassment. He can't even talk straight. He shouldn't be a president at all.
Many people voted for him.
Well, they shouldn't be voting.
Many people, and he still boasts.
Vote suppression.
Yeah, voter suppression for people who support Trump.
He's got about 40% of the country still supporting him, despite everything. And these are the people I would suggest are those who are part of the whole movement towards more of an identity political situation in the United States, and that is what is benefiting Donald Trump and his like, no?
Well, I don't know how much electoral corruption helped Donald Trump, and I also don't know how much of the, fatigue the people who are in the United States have with politics. Why bother? Why vote? Look, you know, like they want to retreat from that. That's what I got. When Obama was president, there was an enormous amount of energy, excitement. People wanted to do things. They had a sense of possibility. It's gone. I mean, as a visible wave in the country, people are demoralized. They're upset, and they're not making that much money, and it's not that much opportunity. It's a bad moment, I think, in America. And so some people withdraw, other people act like those cretins and, we will not be moved, the ones that are behind Trump. And so it's a very negative time, I believe.
There's a question come in from Adnan Nawaz, who asks, has the panel heard of any more representative method of governance than, in brackets he says, failing liberal democracy? How can we ensure that damaging events, his words, like Trump and Brexit, aren't left to the mercy of a small group manipulating the ill-informed? Who'd like to go first?
May I?
Yes, please.
First of all, with all respect, I profoundly disagree with you about, for me, Obama paved the way to Trump. Obama may have had a black face, but that was the only thing black about him. Black people didn't prosper under Barack Obama, and a lot of black people got droned and killed by Barack Obama. In fact, Barack Obama killed more black people in various parts of the world than Donald Trump, although he's only been in a couple of years, has even thought of doing. For me, Barack Obama was not a good president. He was a perfect representation of the extent to which the American political class was two cheeks of the same arse. They didn't matter whether you were a Republican or a Democrat. You made war, you made profits for the military-industrial complex and for the big corporations and so on. And the people who didn't profit got angry. And those people were seduced by Trump's rhetoric, which has turned out to be just as empty as Obama's rhetoric, that somehow he was different. He was not one of these two cheeks. In fact, he was going to drain the swamp and all the rest. Of course, that was Horlicks. But the reality is, I think you used a great phrase. He spoke to the losers. Great phrase, that.
Trump did?
No, yeah, Donald Trump spoke to the losers. He said to the people in the Rust Belt, he said to the people that had not prospered in the years of neoliberal, corporate, globalized capitalist development, he said, these people have all got rich. I don't need to get rich, I'm already rich. I'm speaking for you, and I'm going to fight for you. And of course he hasn't. But it was because he spoke to them in that way that he got elected. And by the way, more people voted in the US midterm elections just 2 weeks ago than have done in midterm elections for decades. So people are not withdrawing. People are intensely interested in politics. In Brexit, 17.4 million people voted for Brexit, the biggest number of people to vote for anything in the entire history of our country. And it was the biggest turnout, 86%, I think, in the referendum. 86%. Given that a number of people must have died that were on the register, nearly everybody voted in the EU referendum. And again, it was the losers that rose up. The Brexit vote was a peasants' revolt, a workers' revolt, the revolt of the alienated, the losers. The people who said, you talk about this European Union, what has it done for me?
Right. Okay, can I get you back to the question? And that is, have you heard of a more representative method of governance than, as I say, using his words, failing liberal democracy?
It's called popular sovereignty. Not that we have any, but there is a model for it.
That's an alternative. Yeah.
Achille?
I guess we have to invent it.
Yeah.
I think that's really the challenge of these times. Liberal democracy, as it has manifested itself, both in the West and in the rest of the world, has reached its limits. It has reached its limits. There are a number of ways in which we can retool it or reanimate it. But if you want us to talk about that, of course we can. But I think it has reached its terminal limits. It's no longer adapted to the kinds of planetary challenges we are facing, not only as nation states or as regional blocs, but as the Earth at large. The Earth is reaching its limits, it's becoming smaller and smaller. It is more than ever before exposed to its finitude.
And
if you want a name for it, it's economic democracy is what we need. You see the factory I told you about that I worked in when I left school? The closure of it has just been announced. And a couple of thousand people are being thrown out of work. The last nail in the coffin of what was once a workshop of the world. These people have no say in whether they can go on making tires or their factory can produce something else instead, because they're owned. The means of production that they gave their best to are owned by somebody else who has made a decision that the factory has to close. Therefore, we don't live in a democracy. We get to put an X on a ballot paper for Tweedledee or Tweedledum every 5 years, but we have no economic democracy.
And what about then the Trump administration and those who voted for him, Kathleen, the losers, as Achille and George would refer to them as? I mean, these are people with valid complaints that were not met by the Obama administration or any administration before, for that matter.
Not met by the Trump administration either.
No,
These people don't count in America political structure. They vote, but they don't count.
Right, let's move on to another question now. George, what are the greatest obstacles to the possibility of peaceful coexistence between Jews, Muslims, and Christians in the Middle East today? Is the deadlock caused by religious conflicts, or is it rather due to rogue capitalism and Western imperialism? Not putting words in your mouth or anything.
It doesn't really have much to do with religion, as you know. It's a classic colonial case, just like South Africa, Zimbabwe, Zambia, all these white colonies. European people came to a poorer, less developed place and took the land and set up an ethno-supremacist effort to build themselves what they would describe as a society. It's horrendous, just like apartheid South Africa was horrendous. White Europeans from the Netherlands, from England, went to Africa, declared themselves superior, and built a political system that allowed them, they thought, endlessly to demonstrate that supremacy. And that's exactly what's happened in Palestine. A group of people came from Europe and took the land of the people whose land it was, and have developed an ideology called Zionism, which has nothing to do with Judaism, nothing at all. In fact, it's the antithesis of Judaism. It's blasphemy, actually, against Judaism. Of course, they sometimes play religious cards and so on, but it's essentially a nationalist enterprise, an ethno-nationalism in Palestine, as it was in southern Africa, or closer to home for you and me, as it was in the north of Ireland, where exactly the same thing happened. We sent settlers to Ireland to seize a small part of Ireland and to make our own interests supreme there. In fact, Zionism, its founders, promised the British that they would create in the Middle East a little loyal Ulster. That's one of the names for Northern Ireland. A little loyal Ulster in the Middle East. That's exactly what they did.
And it's often portrayed as a problem, obviously one of the most intractable problems we have in the world today, the solution to which lies in Washington. That clearly isn't the case, but next year we are to see the unveiling of the great solution, the $1 million plan coming from the Trump administration. Much faith in that?
No, I'm not sure Kushner will still be around to unveil it the way things are unraveling there. No, none at all. From our point of view, I mentioned the hammer and the anvil allusion earlier. The Palestinian people are the hammer, and those who want justice have to be the anvil. And just as no self-respecting person would ever have had anything to do with apartheid South Africa, no self-respecting person should have anything at all to do with apartheid Israel. That's a moral obligation on any right-thinking person. Mandela's grandson, who was recently there, said that apartheid in Palestine is far worse than it was in South Africa, and he was right about that, because the Boers didn't want to drive out the Africans from South Africa. They wanted to keep them there and exploit them. The Zionists want to drive out, and have driven out, what is now more than 12 million Palestinians living in exile as refugees and exiles around the world. And if they could get rid of all the rest, they would.
Let's move on now to technology. You've made mention of the technological revolution that we're living in, and you painted a pretty bleak picture. Kathleen, I was wondering what your thoughts are about the kind of social mobilization that the Black Panthers undertook in those times. How different, how how facilitated might that have been with today's social media, with all of the platforms that are available to us now?
Well, it's not the platform, it's the content. I mean, the content of the Black Panther Party, we put it in posters, we put it in records, we handed out flyers. It was tangible, and they could see the people, and people could join. It was a popular mobilization of young people who really said, we want to change the world. We want to change the world. We want this to be different. Many of them were high school students or college students who were young people who were getting an education and thinking about what they wanted to see in the future. That kind of energy is what you need. But when they saw that kind of energy, what do they want to kill this one and kill that one and then infiltrate and suppress and eliminate it? So when you have a active group of progressive or activist people who have solutions, guess what happens to them? They get shot down. Is that accidental? I mean, who wants these solutions? People who don't have power. People who have power don't want the solutions. And usually the people in power manage to get what they want. That's the problem. That's why we call for power to the people.
Amandla.
A luta continua, and so
La
on.
luta continua.
But the explosion of social media, I mean, this for all of you, has changed life for everyone irrevocably. The Arab Spring, for instance, was probably driven, wasn't it, by not only discontent, but by BlackBerry Messenger, by Facebook, and it drove what was very nearly a successful revolution. I mean, obviously there are negative sides to that, but it is with us now to stay.
Well, I have a question. You're saying the method of communication is what's driving change? The method of communication?
No. The discontent, certainly in terms of the Arab Spring, the discontent was the driving force, but the facilitating factor for what became a revolution was social media. Ultimately, obviously, it wasn't successful, but they were able to raise thousands and thousands on the streets instantaneously almost. And I was just wondering how that would have affected you and your movement at the time.
Well, we did it. We did it in the anti-war. We had thousands and thousands in the streets. In the opposition to the Vietnam War, we had thousands and thousands in the streets, in the Black Power protests. And so driving the masses of people to get into the streets and be active is one thing. Sustaining the changes that they intend to implement is a whole other thing. That's institutional, structural change. Generally, that's where you get shot down.
Did the Black Panthers achieve that? Did they achieve fundamental institutional change, do you think?
I think they achieved the announcement that they wanted fundamental institutional change, and it provided some models of fundamental institutional change. But what you discover is that you get, what do you call it, a little handout, a little okay, yeah, that's fine, and then slap, it's over with. Go back, go home. We don't need you anymore. There's no more Black Panthers. Or no more movement that was that vibrant, enthusiastic young people who wanted to change.
So what are your reflections then on Black Lives Matter?
I think they're a little bit too peaceful for me. No, they're very polite. They're very nice. They have nice hairstyles. But I'm sorry, that's not how you change the world. That's my view.
If I may come back to the question of technology. Of course, I mean, technology as a tool, an instrument to achieve a set of ends, that's understandable. The point I was making has to do with the fact that technology nowadays is no longer just a tool. We are at risk of emerging into a new epoch in which technology has become an end in itself. This is the case insofar as it is allowing the birth of an entirely new species of the human. Now, the human being today, saturated with all these devices, which have become somewhat of our extensions and processes, this human being is not the human being that was supposed to sustain a democratic order, however we want to define the later. So it's an entirely new human being that is emerging. And we should take this absolutely seriously. It's no longer the human as separated from the object. And a lot of our struggles for emancipation in modernity were premised on the idea that a human is nothing but a human. A human is not an object, a human is not an animal, and so forth and so on. Today, the human is a bit more than just the human. So this anthropological shift is something we will have to deal with.
So what does this new human being look like? A 10-year-old with an iPad attached to him. We've all seen them, haven't we? What does this mean? What does this new individual require? What is the effect that drives this individual with the iPad, the iPhones and whatnot?
There are multiple effects. I mean, one of them is really, I would call it anesthesia. Anesthesia and release. Anesthesia of feelings, of emotions, of sentiments, and a release in a totally inhibited manner of all the dark passions we used to think had to be repressed for the social to exist. That the social doesn't exist if we do not hold below certain passions, emotions, and feelings that cannot be expressed.
So is technology
it liberates
enabling
all of
those?
that.
Ah.
It eliminates all these mediations and sets us free, to do whatever we want to do.
Can I comment
yeah,
on
please
that?
do, please.
Look, electricity can keep a baby alive in an incubator, or it can fry a man in the electric chair. The technology is the same. It's who's using it and for what. I give you a heart-warming, life-affirming, quick example. This week, somebody sent me a video of a Syrian refugee boy being assaulted in a school in Huddersfield. 48 hours later, 3.7 million people had shared that video. £150,000 had been raised from the British public for the family of the child. The police, who had known for weeks about the crime and done nothing, have now charged the assailants of the Syrian refugee boy, and he's on bail and has fled the country. Now he's a refugee, and the country, every media, every TV station and newspaper in the country is now talking about this case.
So does the response mitigate the crime?
No, what I'm saying is the people were mobilized by my sharing of that video, and look at the good that came out of it.
Yes, of course.
It was the incubator, not the electric chair.
No, so it can be a poison. It can also be a medicament, if I have to speak in that sense. That's what you are saying, and I agree with that. But I was pointing towards, but this might be too abstract and too philosophical for our audience.
Oh, this is a good university.
Oh, okay, okay. It's a very good university. So
nothing's too abstract for the workers.
It's the kinds of mutations that are going on in terms of who we are, in terms of what the human is becoming. And I just want to flesh that. Maybe this is not the space to go into those kinds of rather obtuse considerations.
Okay, well, I'm sure that you can find much more about Achille's theory on technology and the future human being.
I tweet, therefore I am.
Does the audience get to ask questions? Do you have questions from them?
I'm hoping I've got questions here.
I mean, they gave them?
They've come from Twitter. These have. And so one for you. As a black woman in the US today, what do you deem the most pressing issue in the fight for racial liberation?
The most pressing? Economic security. It's always the most pressing. I mean, in the people who are excluded or the people who are marginalized, economic insecurity is the worst problem. And so if you have economic security, you can have a better house, you can have better education, you can have better health, and maybe you'll actually accomplish some of your goals. But that's limited to people who manage to successfully remain in the middle class for the most part. if they're not wealthy. But there's too many people who are just thrown out of the system, who don't have the education, who don't have access, who don't have a future. It's very demoralizing.
Is there a big difference between the experience for a black man and a black woman in the US today?
Yes, there's way more black women than men. And black women have more access to the society and generally have more education. And they're not intimidating like black men. You know, it's easier, you know, if you go in a hospital, you see lots and lots and lots of black women working in the hospital. You don't see as many black men. Black men are...
In jail.
Yes.
Well, a lot of them are in jail.
Or they're intimidating. You know, they might not be in jail, but the jailing of so many black men makes black men intimidating, and so it's easier for institutions to bring women. And in the black community, there's more educated women than educated men.
Is that because the system it feels less threatened, if you like, by a black woman rather than a black man?
It's because black men are getting arrested and thrown in jail as teenagers. They get records, and they get records, and then what happens? And you're targeted into jail, and that doesn't happen as much to women.
And one has to say, I mean, this is a very serious matter. It's not accidental.
Yeah, you're right about that.
It is systemic.
Yes.
There's a problem in the United States of America with black men. It is a problem that is not new. It is in the DNA of the American state. And the killing of black men, the massive incarceration of black men in the USA is not a matter of hazard. It is part of the survival. That's the way in which the US state pays tribute to itself. It's a necropolitical state when it comes to the life of black people.
Sounds like you're saying they're indefinitely and inevitably racist, in my language.
Whatever we read, I mean, we look at the history.
That's what you said.
It's so obvious. It is so obvious that
that you don't know how to say it.
I don't know how to say it.
No, so, I mean, slavery effectively is not over. I mean...
It's not
no,
over.
This is what we're saying.
It's not over. It's in the Constitution that you can be, if you commit a crime, you can be imprisoned. You go in prison, you're basically a slave if you're black. I mean, it's not that different. You get to work for no money. You get to be isolated. You get to be beaten. I mean, I'm trying to see what's the difference in slavery and prison. I think slavery, you had more freedom of movement, and you didn't live in little boxes of metal. Other than that.
And this is happening on an industrial level. I mean, I've seen the documentary by Ava DuVernay, The 13.
It's a business.
It's a business.
Just like so-called the fight against illegal immigration in Europe is becoming a big business. All kinds of corporation, industries, organizations are making tons of money out of this business. And that is the case with the prisons in America.
That's a business.
It's a business in which the body of black men and blacks in general is turned into a commodity, a captive commodity. And that's how we have to see it. And the fact is that this regime, how you treat black men, is becoming universal. That the way they used to treat black men is now being expanded to more than just black people. That's part of what is the dynamic of this system, George, you were talking about. The becoming black of all these people who do not matter, who do not count, who are made superfluous. I think that is what we have to talk about. These are the challenges of these times of ours. And in that sense, I mean, the color of the skin, it matters still, but it doesn't matter also because the way you treat black people, you can treat many others exactly in that way, with total impunity. You don't have to account for anything you do to them.
Francis Aloko has asked the question on Twitter, what part does education have to play in the fight against racism and racial privilege, both for the victims and the perpetrators? Education.
Education of who, though? The perpetrators or
both,
the education of the
both,
victims?
it would seem.
Well, if the victims that were educated, they might be in a position to be less victimized. I mean, part of the victimization is poor education, poor schools. If you go to jail, you don't get very much education. You're kind of like thrown away, and then become the, what do you call it? The just used. You're just tools.
Marginalized. And
But you're tools. You're used to do, like the prisoners. I mean, the way you have mass incarceration. What is the purpose? That's insane. Why would you want to lock up masses and masses of people?
But they actually do commercial work, don't they, inside these prisons?
It's like slaves, yes, they do.
This is the point, yeah.
Yeah, but that's not a good system. That's evil. It's
the number of black voters in Florida increased by 40% 2 weeks ago in a referendum on the same day as the midterm elections.
Yeah.
Because the
they
previous
let the prisoners.
rule,
The
the previous rule was if you were a felon, you couldn't vote. That means that 1 million black men in Florida had been denied the vote, and it's now been reinstated. So I think you'll see some political change in Florida.
In Florida.
Can I tell you what Lennox Lewis, the former world champion boxer, said in response to the case I told you about, the attack on the Syrian boy? He said, the next time I'm in England, I'm going to go and see the boy that did that. I'm going to try and change his behavior, but more importantly, I'm going to try and change his mind. And I think that's an important and powerful difference. We have to, and it's possible to do it, we have to win white people who are prone to or prey to racism and whose unhappiness and alienation is preyed upon by political forces on the right. We have to win them to an appreciation that they're black too. You don't need to be black to be black, is essentially the point I'm making.
Yeah, that's where we're moving.
Let's go back to the continent of Africa now, and the revolts against colonial culture, which are often caught in what you have called the politics of viscerality. I think you're going to need to explain that, whereby denigrations of African bodies in the past are being repeated in effective responses in today's protests. Tell us what that question means and what your answer is to it.
I won't talk to the question. I'll tell you something even more interesting.
All right.
You see, to a large extent, the future of the planet is being played out in the African continent. I think that is the major political, philosophical, and cultural event of this century. The realization that the future of our world, and I use the term planet purposefully, is to a large extent being played out there. This is the case when you look at the main demographic trends. By the end of this century, Africa will have recovered the population deficit it incurred during the 4 centuries of the slave trade. It will be 1 African over 3 people on earth. Let's say 1 person over 3 on earth will be African. This is absolutely revolutionary in terms of the geo-demographic dynamics of our world, where more and more people here and in Europe and in America will be old people. And the biggest numbers of younger people will come from there. When you look at all that has to do with the crisis of climate change and the future of life itself, of species, the biosphere, that's where you find it. So what I'm suggesting is that we have to get out of this trope where Africa is seen as a basket case, a lost case, and think in future terms. And if we do so, then we'll realize suddenly what is going on, that's the world is changing, and our future here in Norway, in Europe, in America, that is where it is being played out. If we take that seriously, then it opens up entirely new avenues, both for thought and for political practice.
But
so I don't want to answer the question. I suggest that we open up an entirely new debate that hasn't been taking place.
You're assuming that colonization is over for the continent and that African countries will have a certain amount of sovereignty, if you like. And yet there are those that point out that African countries, so many of them, are walking into another form of colonialism, that of debt, coming primarily from Beijing.
Course. Yeah, all of that, look, we can always find, But that's not all that is going on.
Right.
What I'm suggesting that we pay attention to the multifaceted processes that are going on and how they might keep a check on each other. For instance, the Chinese question, what we call the Chinese question, has become an entirely African question. China's rise to hegemony won't happen without Africa. So for us, the question is how is it that we leverage on that in order to establish different kinds of rapports with China. I can go on and give you many more examples, but I'm not one of those who are completely pessimistic about the continent or who blame all its woes on colonialism. After all, I mean, we were there before colonialism. we were there long before colonialism. Colonialism is not only very recent, it didn't even last that long. In my own country where I was born, 80 years. The Germans, 35 years, the rest, French and British, a few decades. But we had been there all along. So, you know what, we'll be there for a very long time.
So you're playing the long game?
Oh, absolutely.
Bravo.
We have to play the long game.
Bravo.
We have to play the long game if we want to have an impact on the future of our world and the future of our planet, which is at stake as we speak. And for some, it's getting late.
What about the movement of people? I mean, one of the themes that you've been...
But that is one of the biggest issues of the 21st century.
Absolutely.
It is the government of mobility. What is going on is that the world is becoming fragmented, segmented. And speed as a resource is being redistributed unequally among the inhabitants of the world. And therefore, mobility becomes absolutely important. And in that sense, since you asked me questions about Africa, I would say that where we need to be moving towards is towards the abolition of colonial boundaries. Africa is a colossal continent. There is objectively no reason why any single African should be dying either in the Sahara Desert or along the Mediterranean coast, trying to go to a place where nobody wants him or her. It's not as if an African or two Africans arrive here and the city is celebrating. There's not one single part of the world where Africans are welcomed. But we have a huge, colossal continent. When you travel from Cape Town to Casablanca, you can spend the whole day non-stop trying to cross the continent. So we have to open the boundary. Africa has to open itself to itself and to the world, because there's still a lot of space there for humanity. That is the direction we need to be taking. And if Europe wants to stop seeing illegal immigrants here and there, it's rather spend more money helping the continent to abolish its internal boundaries, rather than giving it to dictators in the hope that corrupt dictators and tyrants will keep Africans from coming to Europe.
Not just Africans, of course. It was, 2015, where we saw those incredibly shocking scenes of tides of people, mainly Syrian refugees, Afghan refugees, and from other countries as well, most fleeing war and other forms of hardship. And that's when we saw the barriers come up in Fortress Europe, didn't we? Do you think that European
Europe
countries
is in a
they're going to pay a political price.
They keep destroying, making it inhabitable for people over there, they will have to face the refugee whatever problem. You cannot go and destroy people's life over there and hope that you will be at peace here. They will come, just as you were saying. They will. It's absolutely natural. And this is going on all over the place. They are destroying people's habitats. You go to Nigeria, the Delta. Shell, the oil company, has been there since the colonial period. They have completely toxified the waters. People can't fish. The air, you cannot breathe it. They have made it impossible for people to continue surviving.
But Shell hasn't done that on its own. Shell has had complicity
it's
coming from
double
corrupt
predation.
governments.
Shell has done that in collusion with those rulers who are pushed upon our throats, whom we haven't elected, who are supported by major powers, whose bank accounts, we know where they are, in Switzerland, who spend their holidays in London, and all of that. It's a systemic collusion that is making life impossible for millions of people. Sorry? Yes. So they want us to live in the midst of ruins. Of course, not many people will accept to live in the midst of ruins they are not responsible of. I'm sorry, but you are touching, I'm a bit passionate about that.
We love it.
But it's because
All right, well, another question for the panel that has come via Twitter, and that is, to what extent can social progress and justice be achieved, unnecessary wars prevented, and abuse of power exposed through parliamentary and congressional politics alone?
Alone?
Yeah, can politicians, both parliamentary and congressional, can they manage to produce social progress and justice? Can they prevent unnecessary wars and abuse of power? It's a bit of a tall order,
What's the
but this is the
incentive
question.
for them to do it?
Yeah. Why would they want to?
I mean, why would somebody who's elected official have that as their agenda? That's what I'm confused by.
You don't like the question?
No, I just think it's mysterious. There are a lot of people who want social justice. Very few of them are elected officials.
Moving on. Okay.
It's a broader question.
all right.
We need more than the elected officials. We need a
Okay.
whole movement
In that
and
case,
mobilization.
to what extent is direct action necessary? What are the risks considering today's effective polarization?
What's that mean? Effective?
Basically, societies are very, as I understand it, very polarized and therefore not working together. They've clustered in groups of interests and they're not working together.
Is this new? Or have they always been clustered in groups of interests?
And they've always been polarized. I mean, it's not, I lived through the time, you're too young, but in Britain,
Thanks, George.
when Labour and the Conservatives were really the same thing. In fact, Mrs. Thatcher said that Tony Blair was her greatest legacy. And yet, the polarization was not less. The media, the din in the House of Commons and so on was just as rancorous as it is now, when, in Britain at least, there's a real choice. There's a choice between the Conservatives and a comrade of mine for 40 years, Jeremy Corbyn, who has built the biggest Labour Party in the world, the biggest left-of-centre party in Europe, has increased the Labour vote by more than anyone since 1945, and who's standing on a programme not that different from the one I seem to be enunciating in what I said earlier today. That's the polarity in Britain now. That's a real choice. That's not Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And I promise you, the people with power and wealth in Britain are very, very afraid, and so they should be.
All right, supranational institutions. Who wants to go for this one? Are they done for? I mean, I guess this is vis-à-vis the Brexit vote. Many people who voted in the UK to leave the European Union, maybe they thought that the era of the multilateral institution, organisation is over. Was that the driving force?
It's over unless it's democratic. I mean, if you offered me a European Union that was politically and economically democratic, I'd bite your hand off. I'll take that any day. I'd take it in Africa. I'd take it everywhere. But a supranational organisation like the EU or like NAFTA, which actually works against the interests of the majority, it's doomed. If every country in Europe got a referendum on whether to leave the European Union, a very large number of them would take the option to leave, like us. That's why they'll never be given it. And if they are given it, they'll be forced to vote again and again and again until they change their mind. Because people in an incoherent way, yes, sometimes in a left-wing way, sometimes in a right-wing way, in an incoherent way, are rejecting the idea that people can control their lives over whom they have no control, that they did not elect, cannot remove, don't even know their names, wouldn't recognize their faces, but they know that somebody up there is in charge of their destiny, and it's not somebody that they can influence in any way. Those kind of multinational, supranational organizations are doomed, in my view.
What about the UN? There was so much hope in the UN, so much faith was placed in the UN as an institution to keep the world safe after the Second World War. Do you feel that its mandate is over, that its usefulness is over, given that we seem to be retreating much more into the nation state now and away from the multilateral institutions?
It's quite pitiful, the state of the UN now, I must say. As someone who's been all my life really in politics, I'm struggling to remember the name right now of the UN Secretary General. When I was young, the UN Secretary General was really somebody, and everybody knew their name, and they were on the news. And the UN was something that you imagined might solve problems before they got too serious. But nobody's paying any attention to the UN now. Trump sends some, and so do the British, some representative along that are actually figures of fun. The British ambassador to the UN, the US ambassador as was, Nikki Haley, these are figures of fun rather than of substance. And we know from the Iraq war that the powerful, if they cannot bully, browbeat, or bribe the Security Council into agreeing with them, will simply step outside the Security Council and do what they want in any case. I think the Iraq war done for the UN. Finished it.
Achille.
I think there should be a way, I don't know how, of salvaging somewhat the idea of cosmopolitanism, the idea of not world government, but of a number of institutions and instances that have to do with the life of all of us, notwithstanding our belonging to nation states. The fact is that our world is, let's say, the rule of finance today is operating at the expense of the rule of the people. And that, frankly, there is, at the national as well as the world level, an increasing contradiction between capitalism and democracy, in the sense we have been talking about it, representative and all that. And the fact is also that finance knows how to come together at a transnational level. Dominant classes are the most transnational classes we have. And subaltern classes are having a hard time coming together and building transnational forms of solidarity. And as long as this is the case, of course, it will have a hard time prevailing, as George, you were intimating earlier on. So there's a need for something that supersedes the nation state.
How far, then, is what is generally being described as a rise in populism or nationalism attributable to the breakdown of big business, of finance, the 2008 crash, which has led to all sorts of different developments in different parts of the world, but particularly in Europe, we do see this rise in the far right, I mean, to put it bluntly. Is this a direct consequence, would you say, of the failure of big business?
Well, it's not always the far right. I mean, Corbyn's rise is not the far right, but it's a response to that crash. It's a response to the failure of the European Union, of the globalized capitalist model. I have a problem sometimes with commentators who talk about populism, because what sometimes they're saying is, stop talking like that because it might be popular. And we don't want popular. We want unpopular. And, you know, things are populist because they're popular, because people are looking at their own lives, their own environments, their own communities, towns, cities, and so on, and they're saying, what was in this for me? See, people like to think, or sometimes sneer, at the Brexit majority in Britain as, you know, Little England are nationalism. No, it was, as I said, a revolt of the losers, a revolt of the people who don't enjoy many macchiatos served by a pretty Slovakian or Slovenian waitress on knockdown wages, and don't call in a Polish double glazing guy to improve their already very expensive house. It's the people that are made unemployed by that system of so-called free movement of cheap East European, Central European labour. It's them that have, the one thing they have got is a vote. It's the only power that they've got. And they had a chance to vote against the EU in 2016, and by goodness,
but was it really against the EU, or was it against the prevailing political elite who they feel have let them down, have left them?
It was all of it, but the EU is a pretty good representation of the political elite. Take a look at them. Take a look at how they live. Take a look at how they earn, how they party. The EU is in microcosm. I'm talking about the Commission in Brussels and so on. If you've ever visited it, it's like Elysium. They are personified, the elite that people are revolting against. And that's how Trump won, and that's how Brexit won.
If I understand what you're saying. I'm just trying to think about it from where I'm located in Africa, where the political geography is so fragmented. I mean, we have something like 54, or I can't remember how many, microstates, none of which has any weight in the international system. And where clearly one needs some level of convergence, if not unity among all of this, in order to count geopolitically. And there is clearly a need for some if not radical regionalization, at least the constitution of national organizations to carry a proper African agenda. But it depends on who is represented. I think that as long as there's a crisis of representation affecting these institutions, of course we'll have the kind of backlash we are witnessing here and there. But seen from outside, the very idea of Europe, just as the idea of Africa, is not something I would oppose in principle.
There's a gentleman with a question from the floor. If we could have a microphone, please. Here. Our first from the floor. Congratulations.
Thank you. And thank you to the speakers. Achille came with a suggestion that Africa would be one of the most significant continents in the world with the economic development, the expansion of economic development, and mentioned the association with China and how they could develop a cooperation with China based on presumably an alternative type of economic cooperation to the current capitalist neoliberal association. I wonder how, when China has come into the World Trade Organization and has stood forward as a champion of free market things, how weak divided African countries could form an association within the neoliberal capitalist framework that could lead to an alternative form for development. The only place where there have been weak attempts, alternatives, has been Latin America, where countries have had an embryonic attempt at having alternative integration based upon cooperation and not on competition and exploitation. These were brutally crushed during the time of the so-called pink tide, and today we see a right-wing neoliberal backlash in Latin America. Wouldn't that not also be the situation in Africa if they attempted any form for alternatives?
Achille, I think that's directed at you.
Okay.
Would there be a similar kind of backlash to an alternative economic model? Is that basically what your question was?
I mean, I understood it to be a two-part question. One is the problem of China in Africa, which is the object of a lot of controversy and misunderstanding too, both in the continent and elsewhere, with some arguing that Chinese involvement in the continent is just another form of neocolonialism. And of course, I mean, you can always back that kind of argument with a set of facts. The way I see it is that it depends on us, Africans, to shape our relationship with China, which is a very necessary relationship, and which allows us, to some extent, to escape the clutches of the West and of its institutions.
But it's incumbent upon African leadership then to get the right deal.
Yes, not only the leadership, but the society at large, intellectuals, policymakers, artists, and so forth and so on. We have to build a coalition in order to shape our strategic relationship with China and drive it along directions that are, if you want me to just be crude, not neoliberal. For instance, not extractive only. Directions that are susceptible to open up to new economic alternatives, most of which have to do, and this is possible, have to do with our natural resources, the demands of environmental survival, with the amount of sun we have in the continent, the amount of water, the amount of wind, and all of that. Make all of that the basis of an entirely new economy that is not extractive.
Can I ask you to pause at that point, because now we have a rush of questions and we haven't got much time. So can I ask you, please, to be kind of brief with your questions? If you could pass the microphone along. I think we've got 3 in the first 2 rows. So if we could take all 3, and if you could be quite brief, I'd be extremely happy. Thank you.
My name is Sindra Bangstar. I'm directing my question at Professor Mbembe. And let me just mention this, that I very much appreciate you speaking out about your horrible experiences upon arrival in Norway, because these are indignities that Norwegian African friends of mine who travel on a Norwegian passport and who in that sense happen to be privileged experience all the time. And it means a lot to them that you, as such a distinguished international scholar and intellectual, speak out about this. Right, so my question relates to your 2016 article in the Mail and Guardian, where you declared that the age of humanism was coming to an end.
That wasn't my title.
That wasn't your title, right? So we'll blame the Mail and Guardian for that one.
Yes.
But anyway, what I appreciate in your 3 last monographs is the ways in which you attempt to resuscitate the universal humanism of the late and great Frantz Fanon. And I wanted to ask you, in ever so short terms, to tell us what it is about Fanon's work and legacy that can enable us to, in your friend Paul Gilroy's words, pursue a planetary humanism and a global project of conviviality.
I think it's the preoccupation Fanon had throughout his life and his work, and more importantly, his practice, the preoccupation with the question of care. That the question of care, the question of repairing that which has been broken, either by the political powers or by the military. So that deep preoccupation with caring, providing care and repairing is something that is very present in what we might call the black radical tradition, which has a dimension. Kathleen was, you find the Black Matters movement too polite. But this question of caring and repairing is absolutely central to the future of our planet. And that would be the short answer. But caring not only for the human, but also for all the inhabitants of the earth, non-humans included. And democracy will have a future if we open it up not only to humans, but to all the living species with which we share this earth. So it seems to me that that's what makes Fanon absolutely important for the times we live in.
Right, I think we've got 3 more questions, and then I'm afraid we're going to have to call it a day. But if you could be quite brief, and if we could take all 3 questions at the same time, and then hurriedly get our panel to respond.
Good evening, and thank you to all speakers. My question is primarily directed to Mr. Galloway and about his optimism. I must say that as young generations and even those of us who have tried to read as much as possible about the history of social activism and its repercussions on society and its progress, we feel that have been happening and is still happening at a very slow rate. We have many reports coming up from the, as for example, the IPCC panel, telling us that we have 12 years basically to change all of our economic system and therefore our democracies. And in order to achieve that change in the next 12 years, we have to take actions in the next 2 or 3 years. I personally, and a lot of people around me from the youngest generation, is looking at this with very pessimistic eyes. So I am curious, and I am questioning the optimism of Mr. Galloway on thinking that the civil mobilization, we the non-monsters, the losers, do you really believe that we will move fast enough to, save ourselves and the rest of humanity.
Right,
race,
can we
human
quickly
race.
take
Thank
the
you.
2 other questions and then we can hopefully get some rapid responses.
Hi, thank you so much for the discussion so far. 2 quick questions, just to follow up on the question regarding Fanon and his notion of using the past to open up the future. I was wondering if you could comment to get a bit more practical in the discussion about 2 cases. One, the notion of the past in terms of decolonization, where specifically Western Sahara is the one colony left on the African continent. 2, the question of South Africa, and more generally the question of land and land expropriation without compensation as a way of dealing with the past in order to open up the future. Yeah.
And I think there's a gentleman in the front row.
Thank you. My name is Torgeir Skogen. I'm teaching at the German department. And I would like to address a question about the future of national states and borders. The Enlightenment thinker Kant asserted that world peace could best be fulfilled in a system of national states with democratic governments and stable borders. And I would like to ask you if you still think that national states could play such a constructive role, and do you see any positive alternatives to a system of national states and borders?
Thank you. So, George, shall we start with you? The lady there questioning your optimism.
Well, I don't necessarily share the 12-year tipping point argument. I should confess that to you right up front, though as an agitational tool, I take my hat off to it because it's sufficiently apocalyptic that it's got a lot of people like you out and active fighting to stop what is a very real danger of environmental cataclysm and disaster. I think myself that such a disaster, as Marx predicted, is absolutely implicit in the capitalist model. Capitalists have not just a material duty, but a fiduciary duty, a legal duty to maximize their profits for the benefit of their shareholders. They have no alternative duty to look at what life will be like in 100 years from now. Their purpose is me and now, not us and always. And those who, like me and others here on this platform, who project an alternative way of doing things are interested in us and always, not me and now. And if capitalism is the me and now system, it will make as much for me now as possible, whatever the consequences. Indeed, as I say in fiduciary terms, it is legally obliged to do so. So we have to bring countervailing power, force, democratic force to bear, to say that might be in your personal interest, to dig that hole, to burn that gas, to frack that rock, to do that may very well be in your personal interest, but we are acting for the common good, and we say no. And I do believe, I had a long discussion on my radio program about it last night, might be of interest to you. It's talk radio, the mother of all talk shows it's called, and we had an hour and a half on this very subject of quite hammer and tongs debate on it. So I want you to be worried, but I don't want you to be too worried that you go off and cry in the corner. I want you to be angry rather than worried. I want you to be angry rather than sad, and constructively angry at that.
Right, decolonization, Western Sahara, the last remaining colony on the continent. How to deal with the past? I think that's one for you, Achille. How to deal with the past, how to deal with memory.
In the decolonization
in
process.
Decolonization. Have I wrongly paraphrased you?
No.
And in South Africa, land, the issue of land in South Africa.
Oh, the issue of land in South Africa. Oh.
When are you going back?
I'm going back tomorrow. I mean, no, not tomorrow, but it's very, very complex question. And Martin has warned us that she will be impatient. Land has to be redistributed. That's part of the unconditionals. It has to be redistributed for all kinds of reasons. How this is done should be the only question if you want. How do we do it in such a way as to fulfill the promise of the South African Constitution and the Freedom Charter, which specifies that South Africa belongs to all who live in it. It seems to me that is the only interesting, both practical and philosophical question. But there is no debating the principle of restitution. Now, as far as decolonization is concerned, here again, it's a very complex issue. There's a big contestation going on in South Africa around questions of the past and questions of memory. In the younger generations, a lot of people want to, I quote them, burn memory. Because memory, they perceive it as that which is preventing them from imagining an entirely radical new dispensation. Mandela, for instance, is being accused by younger people as having sold out. So there is an urge to revisit the past and redeploy it, but only in the politics of transformation that changes the entire South African political space. So that's what we can say is contestation. As far as the Enlightenment and the capacity of nation states to regulate borders is concerned, I would say two things. I'm interested in recapturing in the philosophy of the Enlightenment all that has to do with the universal right to hospitality, which is at the center of Kant's reflections, for instance, on perpetual peace. Kant makes a set of interesting observations having to do with what to do with the foreigner who knocks at the door. And he says we have to open the door in case refusing to open the door exposes the life of the foreigner to death, which means that we are entitled to close the door, but that we are responsible for what happens to this life. In closing the door, we have to be aware of the fact that the life of this stranger is being at risk or waged in this whole thing. I would like to recapture that and extend it and see to what extent is it that it might form today a pillar for a new ethics of mobility in a world context. And especially in Africa, where clearly we have to open up the continent for its own benefit, but also for the benefit of humanity at large. That it is in the benefit of the human race that Africa stands up on its own feet.
Can you not be the UN Secretary General?
You were my friend.
And so ends Holberg 2018 debate. Over to you, Ellen.
Well done.
Thanks so much.
I just want to thank our terrific panel, Achille, Kathleen, and George, and not least to Martine, who's led us through this wonderful debate. And thank you to the audience for coming. Have a good night.